welcome to another talk in our webinar series. This webinar is also being streamed live on YouTube. You can find the link on our website. This week, we have Justin Myles, a PhD candidate at Stanford University, to talk about measuring lensing survey Redshift distributions with self-organizing maps. Justin, thank you very much for coming. Whenever you're ready.
Great, then I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. So I'm going to be talking to you about Redshift distributions, and they're a central part of lensing surveys and getting cosmology out of lensing surveys. I'm going to be telling you sort of about that problem as a whole and the approach that I've been working on to solve it. As Michelle said, I'm a graduate student at Stanford. I work with Steve Allen, Alex Amon, and Daniel Gruen, and the work I'll be presenting today is work that's been done with a large number of collaborators in the DES collaboration. If you haven't seen a self-organizing map before, there are two examples here on the title slide. Don't worry about the details yet, but we'll be going into more detail about how to understand what these objects are and how they help us with our Redshift calibration. The outline for today's talk: first, I'm going to talk about the Redshift problem within lensing surveys as a whole and try to give some context for this problem and why we should care. Then I'm going to be talking about the method that we've been developing to solve this problem. We call it SOMPZ, and I'll go into the formalism and the methodology of how it works. And we'll wrap up by showing preliminary results of the Redshift distributions from the Dark Energy Survey Year 3 data release. So let's sort of set the stage with understanding why or what we're trying to study, and it's really large-scale structure as a whole. Large-scale structure is a very valuable probe of cosmology, and this relatively old plot illustrates that. So here the radial coordinate is redshift, and you're just seeing whether there's a galaxy at that redshift or not, and really the density of galaxies there. And as we see at the higher redshifts, there's much less structure than at lower redshifts. So this really illustrates, this 2-degree field of data really illustrates how structure has formed over time in the universe. And this is an expression of the cosmological model. And so what we want to do is try to measure this structure statistically and use it to constrain cosmological models. Today I'm going to be talking a lot about cosmic shear, which is one of those statistical measures of cosmology. To sort of motivate why you should care, on the left here I'm showing cosmology contours from 2 lensing surveys compared to results from the cosmic microwave background, which is the Planck contour. So these contours represent the probability of the true parameter being in a particular region, given the data. And there are a couple features that you'll notice here. So first, the CMB contour is much smaller than the lensing contours, and that's because the CMB studies are more mature. It's a more mature field as a whole. And then there's also appears to be like an offset between these contours, just slightly. The CMB seems to be a little bit higher in S8, which is a measure of how much clustering there is in the universe. The other axis, omega matter, represents the matter density parameter of the universe. And I guess what I'd lastly say about this is that another interesting comparison here, another reason why this comparison is interesting is because these probes are measuring the universe at very different times, right? The cosmic microwave background is a relatively early time in the universe compared to what lensing is probing. So if this offset is real, then we want to make sure we understand that. And cosmic shear is host to an interesting debate about redshifts. Redshifts are a really central part of the cosmology you get out of cosmic shear. So what's changed now between the left plot and the right plot is between the blue on the left and the purple on the right is how we handle the redshifts in the analysis. So when you change the redshifts, you can increase this offset between the CMB and lensing into sort of formal statistical tension area. And that's why it's really important to sort of talk about redshifts, because they have consequential impacts on the cosmology that you get out of lensing surveys. So let's back up. For the non-experts in the room, I sort of want to talk about lensing as a whole. How does this work? What's the physics going on here? And to summarize it in one sentence, it'd be that as light passes massive structures, it's bent due to gravity, and this effect shifts, magnifies, and shears galaxy images. So that's shown here on the, so in this diagram, this red oval represents a galaxy image, And here, this foreground plane represents a galaxy cluster, which is very massive, so it's going to deflect the light significantly. If you look at this ray here that I'm moving my cursor over, you see that this deflection causes the observer to see it at some position that's shifted. And additionally, there's a magnification and shear. It's a bit harder to see that in the diagram, but there's a fun trick you can sort of relate this to. So I've got a wine glass here. I've got to change my screen so I can see myself. And this wine glass is going to act, the base of the stem of this wine glass is going to act as a strong lens. So if I put this up against my webcam, you see a little bit, but not very much deflection of my face. But as I pull it away, you're going to see more and more distortion of the image. So that's what's going on here. And if we look at the equations here, it's really evident how that distance matters. So here gamma t represents the shear, and kappa is the convergence, which is another measure of how much lensing happens. And you can see how this kappa depends on the distances in the problem. ds, the distance from the observer to the source, dd, the distance from the observer to the deflector, and dds, the distance between the deflector and the sources. So that's what that wine glass is showing you. Like, as you change this distance, it affects your lensing. And so in order to interpret the lensing signals that we see in the universe, we need to have an estimate of those distances in the problem. This is sort of the full formalism of how cosmic shear works, and it relies on just two measurements. If you want to test a cosmological model of cosmic shear, all you need is a statistical ensemble of two basic measurements: galaxy shapes and redshifts. So the top equation, that's the power spectrum of the convergence map, basically, of your survey. And you can see that it depends on the nonlinear power spectrum of the matter nonlinear power spectrum, which is going to reflect the cosmological model. And this convergence power spectrum can be written on the right-hand side of this equation, which is the 2-point correlation function of those galaxy shapes. So this is it's a summary statistic, right? The shape of any given galaxy doesn't really tell you much about your cosmological model, but on the whole, the statistical correlation of those shapes does. And then the other equation I want to point out is this lensing kernel that shows up in the convergence power spectrum, and it depends on the distribution of redshifts of your objects. So I have two plots which illustrate these two measurements. The left hand shows this 2-point correlation function. So the x-axis is the angular separation of objects in the sky, and you have a huge number of galaxies. So this measurement is binned, right? So in these bins of angular separation, how correlated are the shapes? That's what you see here. At lower angular separation, you have greater correlation at higher angular separation. And the right-hand plot is the Redshift distributions from the DES Year 1 results. So the different colors and the different histograms represent 4 tomographic bins, which are essentially slices of the universe, radial slices in redshift space. And what we're attempting to do is determine what is the distribution of those objects, the distribution of redshifts of objects. So for a given object assigned to a tomographic bin, what is its likelihood of coming from a particular redshift? The bottom right is the kind of measurement that I'm trying to do on DES Year 3 results. And so that's what I'll be showing as we get further into the talk. Now, cosmic shear, which is the galaxy shape 2-point correlation function, is just one of what we call our 3x2-point analysis, and this is the cosmological workhorse of the dark energy survey. I just want to point out that there are other important 2-point correlation functions which serve as useful summary statistics of structure in the universe. The other would be galaxy clustering, the galaxy position 2-point correlation function, and finally galaxy-galaxy lensing, so the correlation function of the shapes of background galaxies with the positions of foreground galaxies. Talk a little bit more about what DES is. It's among a group of leading lensing experiments. It's conducted with the 4-meter Blanco telescope in Chile, and it's collected over 5,000 or about 5,000 square degrees in its wide field survey in the 5 photometric bands listed here over 6 years. The Year 3 galaxy source catalog has over 100 million galaxies, so that data set it's really large. And in addition to this wide field survey, that's sort of the backbone of DES, there's also a 27 square degree deep time domain survey in DES bands that overlap with archival near infrared bands. So I'll be talking a lot about how we can use these deep fields, which were have many science cases. So for example, time domain supernova studies, et cetera, how we use these to improve our redshift calibration. We have about 8 square degrees of the DES bands plus near infrared that we're using for DES Y3. And I'll talk about how exactly do we use those deep fields to help with our redshift calibration. That's really the theme of today's talk. In order to understand that, this is sort of the first physics plot of how is this redshift calibration going to work. Photometric redshifts in general rely on understanding the color redshift relation. So we have a catalog of over 100 million galaxies, and we have very little information about them. We have 3 or 4 photometric bands, and we want to know the distribution of their redshifts, and that's a really hard thing to do because we have so little information about them. This is an example of how that might work, and it's all about understanding the color redshift relation. So the x-axis here is wavelength of light, and the y-axis represents 2 things. For the curves, for the black curves, it represents the normalized flux of a galaxy spectral energy distribution. And the colored regions, it represents the filter transmission. So how efficient is a given photometric filter at letting light of that particular wavelength pass through it. We're looking at a red galaxy, so an elliptical galaxy, and it's at 3 different redshifts, 0, 0.4, and 0.8. And what's important about this is that because it's a red galaxy, it has this astrophysical feature called the 4,000 angstrom break. And you can see that here, that the flux really drops off somewhat rapidly around 4,000 angstroms. So as this spectrum is redshifted, so as you see it moving to the right, all we have to do is really find where that drop happens, and then that gives us a pretty good constraint on the redshift. So as it moves between the filters of our survey, so we just detect that drop in brightness change from a filter, or where we find that drop in brightness, which filter we find it in, that gives us a pretty good constraint on its redshift. So this is an example of how photometric redshifts work, and the key is that in order to get a good redshift out of this, you have to understand the color redshift relation. But unfortunately, in general, the color redshift relation is fraught with degeneracies that are unavoidable in wide field surveys. So this is showing a case where it doesn't work as well. Here we're looking at a red galaxy at redshift 0.3, which is similar to what I just showed in the previous slide, but we're also looking at a spiral barred galaxy at redshift 0.52. And what we see is that in the photometric bands of our survey, in these photometric bands, they're virtually indistinguishable. When you take into account photometric noise, you're not going to be able to tell these 2 galaxies apart. So there are unavoidable degeneracies in the color redshift relation. And the question is, how could we get around these? And it's already evident in this plot. We can see in the near infrared, the H and K bands here, that's where these degeneracies are broken. So this is the photo-Z problem. And this is sort of what we want to focus on directly addressing. And I think that one way to describe the challenge in the field is that many existing prevailing photo-Z solutions don't directly address this problem, which are degeneracies in the statistical color redshift relation. So one thing that we've tried to do is to machine learn the relationship between spectroscopic redshifts, well-constrained redshifts, and wide field flux. But that's flawed because they're necessarily going to rely on training samples of spectra which are biased or incomplete, because the selection function of the spectroscopic samples will necessarily be different than the wide field sample as a whole. And then additionally, another sort of photo-Z solution paradigm is to use template fitting codes. So one way to think about this is you can have some list of templates which represent what galaxy spectra can look like, and you can try to find the maximum likelihood linear combination of these templates at a particular redshift to constrain the photo-Z. But these rely on analytical recipes that can be insufficient to accurately describe the observed color redshift relation. So what we really want to do is try to break these degeneracies in the statistical color redshift relation. And I want to just talk a little bit more about the challenge of selection biases. So spectroscopic redshift samples do introduce selection biases, and these can be key to the redshift debate. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing the plot that I previously showed, which shows sort of this increased tension of Planck based on a different redshift distribution analysis. And on the right, you're seeing from the same publication some attempt at addressing the problem introduced by using spectroscopic redshift samples. And we can see that, and this relies on complex analysis, but you can see that when you try to account for these selection biases, already you sort of get rid of a good deal of that, that tension. So it's really key to the debate, and I just wanted to highlight that here. So that should set the stage for lensing surveys as a whole. How do we constrain cosmology from lensing surveys, and why are redshifts an important part of that? Now I'm going to be talking about our method and how we think that we're addressing the key problem of redshift distributions. We call our method SOMPZ because we use self-organizing maps, or SOMs, to help facilitate this. This sort of diagram illustrates our approach. It's a Venn diagram, and this Venn diagram has axes. So the x-axis here represents the number of galaxies in a particular survey, and the y-axis represents our knowledge of redshift for any galaxy in that sample. So in the bottom right here, we have the DES wide field. So there are over 100 million galaxies, very many, but for each one, we only use R, I, and Z, so 3 noisy photometric bands, which means we have very little knowledge about any given galaxy's redshift. And sort of the other end of the spectrum is the upper left here, where you have galaxies for which you have spectroscopic redshifts or many band photometric redshifts, like in the cosmos field, where there are 30 bands of information. There are comparatively fewer of these galaxies, but for any given one, you can be quite sure about its redshift. And the deep fields, the DES deep fields that I highlighted at the, sort of at the beginning of the talk, they sort of lie in between, right? So we have about 8 square degrees, so many more galaxies than we have spectra for, and we have a good deal more knowledge about their redshift because we have 8 photometric bands on them, including those key near-infrared bands that break degeneracies. So they're sort of in between. The other features of this Venn diagram, for some of those deep field galaxies, we also have spectra and 30-band photoses. So for some of these, we have actual redshifts. And then another important feature is that we have an overlap between the deep and the wide. And how does this work? It's basically an image simulation. So there's an image simulation package called Balrog, which can do several things. And it can inject galaxies into a survey, reproducing the features of the survey. So what we can do is we can take all our deep field galaxies with their 8 photometric bands, and we can inject them with this image simulation package to get a sense of what would they look like if we had observed them in our wide field. And that's what leads to this overlap between deep and wide. And this illustrates what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to leverage the deep fields to break the key degeneracies in the statistical color redshift relation. And it's a kind of leapfrog. It's it serves as an intermediary between redshifts, which we know but have relatively few of and can be subject to selection biases, and our wide field survey. I wanted to show you where these deep fields are in the sky. So for the DES Y3, we use these 3 deep fields, X3, C3, and E2. They have different archival spectroscopy and near-infrared surveys overlapping them. And importantly, they're on relatively different parts of the sky. You can see them overlaid on the DES footprint here. So that'll be important in understanding sample variance later down the road in the talk. And I should highlight that it was a huge amount of work to do this deep field photometric calibration. There's a large team that did this work that helps make this redshift calibration possible. So now let's talk about formally, how do we achieve this goal? How do we leverage the deep fields to improve our knowledge of the statistical color redshift relation? And it basically amounts to marginalizing over deep photometric information. So in the upper left here, what we want to know is that a given RIZ color in our wide field survey, what is the P of Z? What is the distribution? What is our knowledge of redshift? And what we'd like to do is take advantage of our deep field information. So that means that we need to figure out what is the P of Z at a given deep photometric color, shown here, and then what is the probabilistic mapping between deep photometric color and wide photometric color, and that's here, what we call our transfer function. And if we could do this integral, then that is, we think, the correct way of weighting P of Z's in a deep color, which should be relatively narrow P of Z's and which shouldn't be really subject to selection effects, because you think that at 8 colors, your redshift is relatively well constrained. So it doesn't matter the selection effects won't sort of bias you, because at those 8 colors, you know the redshift. The challenge, though, is that that integral is not feasible. It's a high-dimensional integral, and it's very sparsely sampled. You'd have sort of one galaxy at any given particular part of color space. So we have to discretize that integral with categories in order to achieve the same goal. So now what I've done is I've replaced a deep photometric color with the label C, and it just represents some category, which is a part of deep color space. And I have replaced the RIZ wide photometric color with C hat, and that represents a part of the wide photometric color space. We've also replaced that integral with the sum. So instead of integrating over deep color, we're now summing over these categories C. And what we want to know is, at a given wide category C hat, what is the P of Z? And we have to sum over the deep categories and figure out what is the P of Z in each deep category, and then the probabilistic mapping between the two categories. So this is just replacing that integral with something that's more tractable. One other term you're seeing here is S hat. This is just our sample selection function, which is a dependency of each of these respective terms. We have to make sure we're applying it to every sample. Then we can determine the redshift distribution of a tomographic bin, which is labeled here as B hat, by simply marginalizing over those wide photometric color categories C hat. So that's what's shown here, right? So we have the P of Z at a given C hat, and we just need to know how much to weight it, which is essentially the fraction of our sample that's assigned to that category C hat. And once we do that weighting, then we know the P of Z in the tomographic bin. And so this gives us our final formalism here. We can figure out the redshift distribution in a particular tomographic bin by assigning these categories C hat to a tomographic bin and summing over them, and then summing over all of our deep categories, these 3 terms. Our redshift distribution at a deep color, the probabilistic mapping between deep color and wide color, and the likelihood of a galaxy in our sample being at that wide color, which is just the fraction of galaxies in our full sample, in our wide sample, that are that color. Now I'm going to talk about what data do we use to generate each of these terms, try to make it a bit more concrete. The P of C hat given S hat, that's the easiest one. We just need a wide field photometric catalog, and we just need to assign it in some way to different categories, discrete categories, and then the fraction of our sample that end up in each category is this term here. The other 2 terms are a bit more complicated. So the transfer function, the deep-wide relation, we need to start out with our deep field catalog, but then we need to inject it, and we treat this as a black box with the Balrog image simulation package to get a version of its simulated wide field photometry for those galaxies. And we actually inject each galaxy multiple times, so we have a statistical ensemble of what could that galaxy have looked like if it had been observed in a different part of the sky in our wide field survey. And then with that deep and wide information, we can sort of build this statistical relation P of C given C hat. And finally, in order to get the last term here, we need redshifts, right? There's some galaxies for which we have redshifts, actual redshifts, either with many band photo-Zs or archival spectra. And we also need to know deep field colors, so then we can assign them to our deep field categories, and we can figure out the histogram of redshifts for those objects. And that's that last term. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how do we use self-organizing maps to achieve this. I was very careful to describe these as categories rather than as self-organizing map cells. In practice, these categories are self-organizing map cells. We use self-organizing maps to group galaxies of similar colors into categories. But that's not really the important feature of the method. The important feature of the method is the inference. And the fact that we use self-organizing maps to facilitate that is of less importance. Our field is sort of converging on using, weak lensing as a whole is converging on using self-organizing maps to facilitate redshift calibrations. But just because two analyses use self-organizing maps doesn't mean the way that they use them is the same. So now I want to sort of highlight how do we use them. So basically, we categorize galaxies within these cells of a self-organizing map. So the way to look at this is the X and Y axes of these self-organizing maps don't really mean much absolutely. All they really mean is that nearby cells are nearby in color space. And at any given wide SOM cell, we have sort of the PFC hat given S hat, the occupation, and then we also know what is the probability of a galaxy assigned to each deep cell landing in that C hat cell, because we've injected those galaxies into the image simulations, and for each deep sum cell, we know the P of Z. So we just tie these terms together in this way. Now I'll talk just a little bit about how does the self-organizing map learn to smoothly cover color space. So it starts out in sort of the left-hand side here. It starts out with random numbers representing each cell, and you pass it to your catalog of galaxies as a training input. And over time, it sort of learns to map the color space. And this is important because then it facilitates interpolation of cells. If we had no counts in a cell, no galaxies assigned to a cell, we could still interpolate what part of color space it represents because it smoothly covers that color space. This is the iterative training algorithm that achieves that. So here we have a 3x3 self-organizing map, and each cell is a scalar number, and that scalar number is going to be represented here by color. In DES, like for our actual analysis, it's not a scalar, it's a vector. For the wide SOM, wide photometry, it's going to have 3 numbers in that vector representing R, I, and Z. The deep SOM will have 8 numbers in that vector representing those 8 photometric bands. But for this illustrative example, if we had this galaxy training input I of this color, it would be assigned to the cell that's most near to it in color, and then that cell and its neighboring cells would have their colors slightly perturbed to be more like that color that was just assigned to it. And so you can see that if you compare sort of these two colors, it's more obvious. After this input has been assigned to the cell, they're now closer together. So as you pass a huge number of galaxies through this iterative training algorithm, then your SOM maps the color space of your input sample. That's SOMPZ, that's how it works. But I want to highlight that a modern cosmological analysis necessarily depends on using numerous independent constraints and sophisticated sampling procedures over relevant uncertainties to verify the robustness of the overall measurement. So what I just showed you is how we can get redshift distributions from TES, but there are also several independent ways we can get redshifts from TES data, and we do those independent ways, and we combine them together as a sort of verification that everything is working. This complicated flowchart illustrates that full scheme. So there are clustering redshifts, there are shear ratio redshifts, and they're all combined, and uncertainties are sort of handled properly. And just want to highlight that there's a lot of work going on by a lot of different people to make that all happen. All right, so that's our method and where it fits into DES. And now I just want to show some results and talk about how does this work. Breaking down this part of the talk, first, I'll validate the method on simulations, so prove to you that it works on simulations. And then I'll talk to you about the result of the method on data. We'll just show what are the results on DES-Y3. And then we're going to talk about 3 key sources of uncertainty. So I want you to remember these because I'm going to poll you all on which you think is the most important. The first is sample variance in the deep fields. The second, and that would be another description of that, is the fact that the deep fields are relatively small patches of the sky which are not reflective of the universe as a whole. And then the deep field photometric calibration error, the fact that our deep field magnitudes that are so key for making sure we're weighting our redshifts properly, those have some errors. And then redshift sample biases. The redshifts that we're actually using can be wrong themselves. After that, I'll talk about a sampling procedure we developed. We call it probability integral transform sampling, PIT sampling, or rather applied to this problem. And this helps us generate an ensemble of redshift distributions, which incorporate those uncertainties, those very same uncertainties I've just mentioned. All right, so this is proof that it works. This is showing that on average, the method recovers the true redshift distributions in simulations. Well, this is a result from the buzzard simulation, so a galaxy catalog that you get from underlying n-body simulations. And the solid thick line represents the truth. This is the true redshift distribution of galaxies in a given tomographic bin. The very fine dashed lines represent our estimate of the redshift distributions for one of a set of realizations of the method. And what changes from realization to realization is where in the sky we pick the deep fields in the simulation. And you can see that any given one may differ from the truth, but if you look at the mean of these, they match up with the truth quite well. And that's what's shown in the dashed thick line. And this is the result on data. So this is the fiducial estimate of the redshift distributions of the DES-Y3 survey. We've assigned these galaxies to 4 tomographic bins. We only use R, I, and Z, so we think this is the best that you can do in assigning these galaxies to 4 tomographic bins. The question is then, what is our uncertainty on this measurement? And now I want to talk about those different uncertainties and how do we tie them together to sort of generate an ensemble of redshift distributions, which are all slightly different from this fiducial result, and that which incorporate our uncertainty in the measurement. All right, so now here's a poll. There's a little link you can go to at the top here, and here you can vote on which of these sources of uncertainty you think is most important. Can you now see my Firefox browser, which should give you live results of the poll?
Yes.
Great, thanks.
Can you share the link of the poll on the chat? I think that will help people to follow it.
Definitely. Let's see. So if you click on that link, it should give you the chance to vote. I'm going to attempt to vote to make sure this is working as well. Okay, cool. Wait just a minute or so more. So some people think it's the redshifts, some people think are deep field calibration. Okay, more people think that it's deep field calibration than the redshifts. Interesting. Cool. Okay, this is interesting to see. We're going to talk about each of these, and in some sense, there's no clear answer because they are of different importance in different regimes. So some of these are more important at low redshift, and some of them are more important at high redshift. And we'll get into seeing that at play. Interesting that no one said that sample variances in the deep fields was important. We'll talk more about this. Thanks for participating. All right. So you should now be able to see my slides again. Let me know if you can't. And this is about sample variance in the deep field. So we can derive a simple estimate on the uncertainty in the mean redshift per bin due to sample variance by doing what I said earlier we did. Run with many different underlying deep fields in the simulations, and that's what's shown here. So each of the 4 panels is a tomographic bin, represents a tomographic bin. And this is a histogram of the difference between the estimated redshift, mean redshift in that tomographic bin, and the true mean redshift in that tomographic bin. And so that sort of forms these distributions. And what's changed again is where are the deep fields in the sky. So you'll notice, for example, at the 0th bin here in the upper left, it's a much broader distribution than the last bin, which is the bottom right. And that's because of the physical volume represented by these redshift bins is different, right? At the higher redshift bin, that physical volume is larger, so you're going to have less sample variance because it's physically larger. And also interestingly, the bias, sort of the mean of this distribution is written at the top here. So if it's upper left, it's 0.005. So on average, that's the mean of this distribution. So on average, we're biased. This is also happens to be greatest in the lowest redshift bin. This is actually kind of good news, right? Because our lowest redshift bin is where we have the least cosmological constraining power. So this will have the least impact of any of these bins on the actual cosmology result. And fortunately for the higher bins, it's less. But even in that bin where we do the worst, it is about half as large as the year 1, or the width of these is less than year 1. So we're still doing better than year 1, but this gives you an estimate of sample variance. The greatest criticism you could make of this is that the sample variance in the simulations is not guaranteed to be the same as the sample variance in the actual universe. It's an important criticism, but fortunately, as I mentioned, because we do numerous independent ways of evaluating these things, we also have a way of calibrating uncertainty due to sample variance directly from the data. That's work led by Alex Heller-Cohen, based on publication Sanchez et al., and also part of our broader scheme, and we have found, to begin with, sort of agreement between these two methods. So we do sort of have that consensus. So now I'll talk about the photometric calibration error. This is what's shown here now is this is an ensemble of results, and it's again on simulations. And what I've done is for each realization in the ensemble, I have drawn from a multidimensional Gaussian whose widths are set by the uncertainty on the 0 point in any given photometric band. And then we sort of just offset our deep field magnitudes by that drawn from the Gaussian. So we're just changing the input magnitudes in the deep fields for each realization. And now what we see is really interesting, because the spread, how much that changes your redshift distribution, seems to be confined to very particular redshifts. So we see here roughly around 0.8, roughly around 0.55 something. We see the spread in both of these tomographic bins, and then again, sort of at low redshift around 0.1. And so this is actually, again, you're seeing what from my first science slide, that 4,000 angstrom break, which is so key, which is such an important part of the color redshift relation. As it changes bands, our determination of the redshift changes a lot. And we can actually detect that, because the redshifts here, where you see all this spreading out, is where that 4,000 angstrom break is switching a band. So this is an important photometric calibration error at these particular redshifts. And most importantly, you can see at these lower redshifts bins because of this particular spread here and again here. And then finally, the systematic biases in the redshifts. This is one of the more topical points of discussion in this field. I've hidden the axes here, so you can't get too much out of this. But what I want to point out is that our cosmology result will robustly account for the uncertainty in our estimate due to these systematic biases. So on the x-axis here is which tomographic bin we're talking about. And the y-axis is how much does the mean redshift in that tomographic bin change when you're using a particular redshift sample. I've hidden the axes until the DESY3 results are public, but I just want to focus on 3 lines here, the blue, orange, and red, which represents 3 different redshift samples. And importantly, we're doing this analysis using all of the redshift samples that are available to us and which we think are valid. So this is an important part of our uncertainty, right? You can see, even with no numbers, you see there is some shift introduced by using different redshift samples. So there is some shift introduced when you use spectra as much as you can versus when you use Cosmos 30 photoses as much as you can. But our cosmology result will robustly account for this uncertainty, right? This will lead to larger cosmology contours, but we think that because we use every possible redshift sample, that our cosmology contour will not be biased because of this uncertainty. It will only be more uncertain, not biased. So those are the 3 uncertainties, and now I want to talk about this pit sampling. And pit sampling, the idea is, well, we have these uncertainties. How do we combine them to sort of generate an ensemble of redshift distributions which incorporate those uncertainties? That's what's shown here. So the upper left here is the plot you've seen before. This is an ensemble of estimated redshift distributions based on using different deep fields in the sky. So this incorporates sample variance. And the question is, well, we think that sample variance is right. What we really need, though, is an ensemble of the data, the data redshift distributions, not simulations. And the question is, well, how can we transfer that variance in this ensemble into the data? This is how we do it. So we compute from each of these probability distribution functions, we can compute an inverse cumulative distribution function. So we've just sort of flipped the axes and integrated. The x-axis now is percentile, the y-axis is redshift. And we can compute the difference between the inverse CDF of any given realization and the mean, and that's shown in the bottom left. So now again, percentile, and now what we're looking at the y-axis is delta Z. So what this shows is for each tomographic bin, a smooth function of how much different is that realization from the mean. And this sort of encapsulates all the information we want to sort of transfer to data. And the way we achieve that is by adding this curve to the inverse cumulative distribution function of the data N of Z, and then, taking the inverse again and redifferentiating to get a PDF. And that's what's shown here in the bottom right. So now the solid line is the data fiducial N of Z. So the redshift distributions of our DESY3 catalog. And the dashed line is a perturbed version of that fiducial estimate, where the perturbation is smoothly defined by one realization of the simulations. So we've started with an ensemble in simulations and a fiducial estimate in data. We take one of the realizations of the ensemble in simulations. We transferred all of its sample variance into the data. So that's how we generate an ensemble in the data. This is interesting because in the past we were limited in that all we could do was sort of shift the mean of the realizations, and that incorporated our uncertainty. But shifting the mean is just changing one moment of the distributions. And now we can turn off any given specific moment to the Redshift distribution, because we're not just transferring the mean, we're transferring all of these moments. And turning on or off these moments, we can actually see how much does our cosmology depend on shifts in the variance of the Redshift distribution. So we'll actually be able to learn a little bit about how much our cosmology depends on the Redshift distributions to a greater extent because we've developed this sampling procedure. Here's a slide illustrating that it preserves the shift on the mean. So what's shown here now is we generated an ensemble in the data from this pit sampling from the ensemble in simulations. And now what we're looking at is the shift on the mean of that ensemble in the data. And the widths of these histograms are the same as the original widths in the simulation. So this is just proof that we have preserved the shift in the mean redshift per bin from the underlying simulations. And importantly, again, we transfer not only the shift in the mean, but the full information of the variation in the redshift distribution. So we're going to be able to test how much our cosmology depends on these specific ones. All right, so that's the talk today, and I'll summarize. The first point is that SOMPZ aims to directly address the fundamental photo-Z problem, which is degeneracies in the color redshift relation. And we do that by leveraging deep many-band photometry. We've done that and characterized the key uncertainties in our results. And the answer to which uncertainty is most important depends on which regime you're talking about. But the solutions are listed here. So we do need to maximize the overlap of near-infrared and optical wide field surveys to beat down our uncertainty with sample variance, which is most important at the low redshift bins. We need to collect more spectra to reduce our uncertainty due to redshift biases. And then we also need to improve the photometric calibration in our deep fields, particularly in our bluer bands, to sort of make the most out of this method. So in this sense, we need to sort of work on our data products in order to take full advantage of the method. Then finally, I've talked about a new method of generating an ensemble of redshift distributions that reflect our uncertainty in the underlying distribution that preserves not just the mean, but higher order moments. And that'll be interesting for future tests of how these higher order moments affect our cosmology. Thank you for listening. I do want to highlight that this is work done by a large set of teams, and in particular, SOMPZ would not be possible without work from the deep field photometric calibration team and the Balrog team, which helps our image simulation effort. And with that, I'll take questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Justin. Yes, questions.
Hi. Hi, Justin. This is Julia.
Hi, Julia.
Thanks a lot for this great talk. I've seen several times your talk about SOMPZ before, but this time I'm very glad to see the details in the methodology. It's become very clear now, all the small things. I have a couple of questions. First, going back to basics, how exactly do you define these tomographic bins? How do you know? How do you select which galaxies belong to which tomographic bin? Because you have these tails that go beyond the interval limit. So
yeah, great question.
A lot of it.
Yeah, the tails they're frustrating. So we make our bins as follows. We basically assign each galaxy in our Balrog sample according to a tomographic bin, according to some arbitrary bin edges, right? So we pick arbitrary bin edges in redshift space, and we assign each wide sum cell to the bin to which a plurality of its constituent Balrog galaxies are assigned. So to which of those if we set up these arbitrary bin edges, to which tomographic bin is more Balrog galaxies assigned than any other for a particular wide sum cell. And that's the bin that cell then gets assigned to. And we tried out a number of ways of doing this binning, and we didn't get a lot of effect in terms of the overlap of the tomographic bins. And for the non-experts in the room, Julia is referring to the fact that ideally our tomographic bins would be completely non-overlapping, and they're evidently not. But that's what we ended up deciding on. And we also do sort of test how much that overlap affects the cosmology. So you'll be able to see that in the final results.
All right, thanks. And would it be possible to use the SOMPZ to extract single photoses for each galaxy?
Good question. So I would say the yes and a no. So for each galaxy, we have a wide SOM cell assignment, and we have a histogram, a P of Z, of that wide SOM cell. So for any given galaxy, we do absolutely have a constraint on its P of Z. But the constraint on its P of Z is no different from the constraint on the P of Z of any other galaxy assigned to that wide SOM cell. So the answer is that, like, yes, we get a P of Z, but it's not particularly narrow. Yeah.
All right. And our last question is more technical. How do you run that? Do you parallelize the sample? How do you actually put this algorithm to run in very large sample? Do you run the SDM directly? How do you do that?
So are you referring to the SOM training itself?
Not only the training, but when do you apply that to the wide sample? So you have a very large number of galaxies to.
Yeah. So the training, I don't think we can parallelize because the training is iterative. The state matters at any given part of the training. So I don't think that we can parallelize the training, but we can parallelize the assignment once the SOM is sort of set. What each cell represents in color space. Once that's set up, then we can parallelize the assignment, the final assignment of galaxies. We did some work on that latter parallelization, but not for the training. We did this.
Do you separate it in regions of the sky or in redshift bins? How do you separate your different runs?
So which different runs are you referring to?
If you apply to the large sample and you do that in parallel, how do you define the different realizations that are done in parallel? Do you split the sample in smaller pieces, and then which parameter do you use to split the sample?
So I'm not sure if the question is whether I can answer either of what I think the question is. So if we're talking about different realizations of runs on the simulations for estimating sample variance. No, is that not it?
No. I'm wondering about the running for the whole DES. You don't do that data at once. You probably parallelize that.
Yeah, so we do it in chunks of rows of the DES catalog.
Okay, that's the answer I was waiting for. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for your questions.
Justin, I have a question. Hi, it's Rogério.
Hi.
In the year one analysis, the uncertainty in the redshift distribution was just captured, let's say, by the uncertainty in the mean of the redshift distribution for each mean. Is that the same thing for year three? Is the same procedure, or people are thinking of doing something more sophisticated?
Yeah, I think that what's changing in the year three analysis is that we will be sort of this is work led by Juan Pablo Cordero, but we'll be sort of sampling on more than just the changes to the mean. Now, whether our cosmology is sensitive to that is, I think, a different question, and I don't have an answer to that. In other words, we're attempting to sample in a way that's more sophisticated than that. How much that actually impacts our cosmology, I don't know how clear that is yet.
Thank you, Justin. And say hi to Nick.
Will do, yeah.
Okay, more questions? Then yeah, I have a question. So when you showed that you transfer the sample variance from one of the sample of the sample to the PDF, in the end you got this PDF that was like more noisy kind of like, right? But what does that mean exactly? So it means that the sample variance is affecting different redshifts in this almost random way, or?
Yeah, and maybe one way of thinking of that would be at what redshift do you have a large structure in the simulations in that particular patch of the sky? Because if you have a large structure there, that sort of structure will define your reweighting. Because there are deep fields, one way to think about it is you have these redshifts, and you want to reweight the redshifts according to their likelihood of showing up in your wide field. And the way that you do that reweighting is by sort of the counts in deep color space. And if you have greater counts in deep color space because of some structure, then that will sort of boost your N of Z there. Does that make sense?
I see. Yeah. So it's kind of like a tomographic weighting of the contribution based on the structure on that tomographic bin, more or less.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Oh, interesting.
And we sample over this ensemble in the cosmological chain. So any given one of those N of Z just sort of gets picked a set number of times in the cosmological chains.
I see. Okay, more questions? Then I guess I'll go again. So you showed how you propagate that, and what's the effect when you combine that source of uncertainty with the bias and the calibration of the photometric calibration?
Good question. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that because we're ultimately going to be combining uncertainty. Like when we combine uncertainty, the only way to really have correct results at that point is to have combined all the uncertainties and all of and also sort of like we want to know, we want to use our clustering redshifts, shear ratio redshifts, sort of combine it all. So I don't have an answer just showing like combining those uncertainties into generate one ensemble, but the pit transform sampling absolutely does enable us to combine them.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions. Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap it up. Next week, we'll have Michelle Wingham from the University do Vale do Itajaí. Thank everyone for coming, and thank you very much, Justin, for this very interesting presentation. I love the wine glass example. Was the first time I saw that analogy. Very interesting.
Glad to hear it. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.